Welcome back to the table, friends. I am your humble host, GreyDMs, and with me, as always, is my co-host and co-conspirator, Owen.
Hello.
You are listening to Tabletop by Night, a weekly podcast where we continue our exploration of Vampire the Masquerade. Tonight, we gather around the table to answer the question, why should you eat the rich?
High in protein?
Yes. So today, we're going to be talking about the Anarchs. So we're pulling back a little bit from the individual clans that we've discussed so far, and we're going to talk about one of the other sects so that we can then talk about other clans. We mentioned them a little bit in the Camarilla.
Yes.
We talked about them briefly in mention of the multitude of vampire philosophies and organizations, but we're going to dive a little bit deeper into how they came to be and why they're probably in current 5th edition the most numerous of all the vampiric sects.
Basically the easiest ones to get into.
Yeah, because they kind of assume that everybody who's not Camarilla or Sabbat is one of them.
Yeah. I mean, and that's probably a lot of people once you really get to know the Camarilla and the Sabbat.
Yeah. So I think we kick it off, as always, with a quote. Some of you may recognize this one. You are not your job. You are not how much money you have in the bank. You are not your car you drive. You are not the contents of your wallet. You are not your fucking khakis. You are the singing, all dancey crap of the world. I thought that was pretty appropriate.
Yeah.
For the Anarchs.
Yeah, true.
So, rewind time a little bit. Let's start talking about some of the events that led to the Anarchs coming to the forefront.
Okay.
So, later on, we're probably going to talk about Carthage when we talk to the Brujah, because Carthage is essentially the good old days that we won't let die. But the story of the Anarchs is largely the story of the Brujah, so unfortunately we're going to talk a lot about Brujah in this, in this one, mainly because the gangrel kind of are antisocial, so they don't want to belong to a political movement.
Right.
Yeah. So if you remember, Carthage was a center of North African and Mediterranean Empire, of a North African and Mediterranean Empire that rivaled Rome in the 2nd century BC. And of course, we remember who was in Rome.
No, who was in Rome?
The Ventrue.
Right.
Yeah. Only the correct answer. There's only one answer. So obviously, if the Ventrue are not the thing you're talking about, the Ventrue are going to be involved in taking the thing away.
Right. That looks nice. What are they cooking over there?
I don't like that. So Carthage was sacked and destroyed by Rome at the end of the Third Punic War. In the World of Darkness, this Carthaginian society was dominated by the vampire clan, the Brujah. Now, depending on who you talk to, what scholars you believe in, Carthage was somewhere between an idyllic society where vampire and human coexisted, both to better everybody else in society, or maybe the Brujah just ruled everything with an iron fist and sacrificed children.
Oh, I mean, that's quite... You got two sides of the coin there, very different from each other.
Yeah, and one of those is the opinion of the Camarilla.
Oh,
so you can kind of guess why. So depending on like what political slant the particular, not philosopher, but particular researcher or scholar is, receptive to, the story of Carthage will always end up talking about basically an idyllic situation for the vampires involved.
Right.
Whether or not it was also idyllic for the humans is the big question. So the Brujah now, especially over the years, view it as kind of an idealistic golden age. It was like their great experiment. It was their great success. So it being taken away is a source of resentment that essentially will last throughout time.
Right.
It being taken away by the Ventrue means that the creations of the Ventrue are always going to be the enemies of the Brujah.
Right.
Even when they have to kind of coincide. So the sacking of Carthage really meant that any type of organization that the Brujah essentially had in the beginning was gone. So many Brujah did join the Ventrue. They did join feudal lords, the rulers. They became warriors and generals and leaders and tried to fit their like slot in the whole great plan.
Right.
But also many just became rabble-rousers and travelers and rebels. So as Brujah do, they tend to organize resistance. So even early as the 19th century, there was a group known as the Furores.
Yes, the Furores. I'm familiar.
You are?
No, I'm not.
I was like, shit, is that some sort of historical thing? That I don't know?
Look who you're talking to.
So basically, like as Rome kind of fell, a lot of the Ventrue and a lot of the more powerful, potent vampires in the aftermath of Rome kind of settled into their own domains across Europe.
Mm-hmm.
And as with always, one of the burdens of the youth is knowing that the old always have all the power.
Right.
But in mortal society, there is the promise that with age and with time, the power will pass down to the young.
Yeah, you kind of don't have that in vampire society. That
Immortality
never
kinda
dies.
Gets rid of that.
Yeah.
Immortality essentially throws that out the window.
It's like, hey, Jim the younger, dude, like, I'm 800 years old. Yeah, but Jim the older is like 1,000. So it sucks to be you.
I mean, in the span of vampire generations, the elder vampire generation can have children who can be in a shitty position, and their children are in just the same shitty position, and their children's children are also. Because
this kind of sounds like Europe a few hundred years ago.
It's weird, huh? Art imitating history.
Yeah.
So groups such as the Furores or the Prometheans, which were, I think, either a different, more cerebral version of them, were basically groups of people that were trying to buck the status quo. They were rebels. They were often like sheltering other rebels, people that were driven out by princes of various domains, the people that like fought back. Imagine that are Robin Hood.
Oh, yes.
They kind of fit directly in one of these. So elders were generally considered, or were generally not just considered, they were very domineering and abusive to their childer. Ultimately, up to the First Inquisition, we saw this where they would literally embrace and then send their childer off to fight the human,
So is this like a tough love sort of thing, or is this just, like, hey, I don't really give a shit what happens to you, like, go fight?
Yeah, I think it's a little bit of the latter.
Okay.
So there were always sires who basically would find some sort of childer that they wanted to nurture and take under their wing, but like that didn't mean you shared power with them. And when your power was threatened, kind of an easy equation, right?
Yeah.
Like send them to the wolves.
Man, I mean, doesn't really sound a whole lot better than what the Ventrue were doing,
Well, you're thinking like a Brujah. So the Furores took basically a heavy-handed stance against authority and the traditions of the elders, because one thing that generally happens when you have an older vampire that's in a position of authority is that not only do they want to fight any challenge to their authority, but they want to fight any challenge to anybody's authority like them, because if they're going to go knock on, your neighbor's door and tear him out, then they're going to come for you next.
Right.
So elders, the only time they were guaranteed to kind of get along was when they were basically dealing with their own child or dealing with upstarts. So the Prometheans were more ideological. They often saw themselves as trying to basically give humanity back the ideals of Carthage.
Okay.
Give the fire back to humanity, literally.
That's a good comparison.
So yeah, the strongest point that was shared by both of those two clans was essentially escaping and protecting against the tyranny of the elders. So if you go back to what we were talking about with the Inquisition, you can kind of see the forces at work that led to the Anarch movement. So you have a bunch of elders in positions of power. They do not want to give up these positions of power. And of course you have humans who are now onto them. They're starting to organize and starting to move in mass, and they're starting to dig out, basically vampires out of their havens. And the elders start sacrificing their childer. They start embracing or just turning evidence over on their childer to basically give them breathing room to feel comfortable. So
they're making like shock troops, or they're just like embrace and then, oh, there's a vampire right there.
Basically.
Okay.
Both actually. So pretty quickly, these groups of childer who are basically raised in an age where essentially they are either shock troops or at best they've got a little leeway to try to get ahead of the inquisitorial. Nope.
Just the Inquisition.
Inquisitorial.
There you go.
So yeah, so they had a little bit of time to get rid of to get ahead of the inquisitorial forces that were basically bearing down on them. They started talking. They said, "Hey, this is kind of crap, right? Like we are we are essentially fighting a war for people who are not giving us credit. They're not backing us up. They're not giving us help." So one of these figures that came up was Patricia, eventually now known as Tyler, the person who basically started out with political upheaval in Britain, thrown in jail. Robin Hood was like, "Hey, you got spunk, kid." Went around as a Brujah and was like, "Wait a second, now I'm a vampire and everything's gonna be great. Oh crap, Inquisition."
Now I have new enemies.
This sucks. So basically a group of Brujah surrounding Tyler basically went forth and petitioned to the elders, like, "Hey, we actually need help doing this. Like what you're doing is not cool. It's not cool sending us to the wolves. Why don't you actually start amassing some forces and let's dealing with this?" Well, the problem is the elders were all getting together and they were like, "Oh, well, maybe we could just hide."
That's a good idea.
So this, of course, led to the first Anarch rebellion, and this kind of led to the forming of the Anarchs. So in the fighting between the Anarchs and the elders back then, before they were officially labeled Anarchs, this all kind of came to a head at the Convention of Thorns. So the Convention of Thorns was when essentially the elders came together and they said, "Hey, we have a real problem. We now want to actually formally lay down some rules here." So that's when they came up with the tenets of the Camarilla. And of course, the younger rabble rousers,
right?
They thought their elders, so the elders of the Gangrel and the Brujah, were going to go into the Convention of Thorns and basically say, "Hey, like that's not cool. You guys need to help and do your share." But Ventrue play politics well, and
right?
Of course, all the elders were like, "Yeah, we can give some kids up in order to like play by the Camarilla rules." And so the young kids basically were the ones who were like, "No, screw this. We're going to form our own group with blackjack and hookers."
Right. I mean, that's always the best idea.
Yeah. So the Anarch movement was born, and then, of course, parts of that movement split off into the Sabbat, where they were like, "It may be a good idea to eat those elders." Yeah, wouldn't that be nice? But
so is that what happened to the Brujah elders? Did they get devoured?
Oh, no. They got brought into the Camarilla because they played ball.
Okay, gotcha.
So for a long time, basically, the Anarchs, also known as the Unbound, or essentially anyone that doesn't give heed to Camarilla rule, except for the Sabbat, who are a cohesive religious zealotry
right
group, So if you were like ran off into the middle of the Wild West and you had a couple of vampire buddies and you basically decided to settle up in some town like Tombstone and were like, "Hey man, we're just going to be cool and hang with each other and not screw with each other," you were Anarchs by default. That's who the Camarilla saw you as, right? Because you weren't running around going like, "I must hunt all the elders and drink from their souls."
Right.
You were just like, you're not playing by the rules. And so the Camarilla would come to town, and then you had some choices to make. Either you were going to give in to the Camarilla, or you were going to have to like formally start saying like, "Well, maybe we need some structure and we need to fight back."
Right. Or run away like the elders did.
Or just run away like the elders did. So the big thing to know about the Anarchs is they themselves are not really a sect per se. They're essentially a loose group of...
A coalition.
Yeah. They're a loose group of basic ideologies that involve not following the Camarilla. So This is why in a battle between the Camarilla Ventrue, or the Camarilla vampires, who are clearly outnumbered by the Unbound, they still essentially win most of the time, or they still essentially hold their own, because Anarchs are also very, very prone to infighting and breaking down. And
they're kind of like orcs from 40K.
Kind of. Like you can whip them up into a frenzy and then you got a problem, but if you just let them peter out, they're going to probably start duking out with each other and stop doing anything. So throughout the ages, the Anarchs were always kind of like a check against the Camarilla, and often they did at least understand that both the Camarilla and the Anarchs needed to see eye to eye in regards to the Sabbat. Like when the boogeymen come knocking at your door, the one thing that the Anarchs and the Camarilla also agreed on was the upholding the Masquerade. They felt
that's probably a big one.
Yeah, they said all the other tenets that were the elder Brujah, the elder Gangrel agreed to were basically all things that allowed the old to keep power, but the Masquerade was something that benefited everybody.
Right.
So
just don't need another one of those Inquisitions coming around.
No, absolutely not. Funny enough, it did.
Yeah, and it's because of the Nosferatu.
Yeah. So we talked a little bit about, of course, the Second Inquisition coming and a lot of the problems that were happening. But something that became of the Second Inquisition was that we had the Convention of Prague.
Okay.
I think we talked about this a little bit in the Camarilla, where, okay, so an important thing that I glossed over was actually the Anarch Free State, which was California.
Oh.
So one of the things that happened in California, and we'll talk a little bit more about this when we start talking about some of the individual anarchs who really matter, mainly the Anarch Jesus Jeremy McNeil, apparently.
Okay.
Yeah. There's a lot of people, different authors have a tendency to gravitate towards certain characters in the setting. And really, what I'm assuming they were written once is kind of like, hey, this character belongs in this story. And then other characters started referring to them almost as a mythos.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so a lot of young vampires refer to these guys as like big shots when maybe, anyway, maybe
they're actually more of just a footnote or a filler or whatever.
Or just a combination of a bunch of guys from different movies that they really thought was cool.
Oh, no.
We'll get to that. Anyway.
Snake Plissken.
So California became basically California and most of the West Coast became an Anarch Free State in 1940.
Okay.
When basically the remaining Camarilla that were there were overthrown.
Okay.
This is an event.
Like this is all going on during World War II.
Yeah. And we'll actually talk about it when we start talking about this person specifically. But that's to say that in America, like the West Coast was mainly Anarch territories. So that was, the Camarilla didn't exactly have sway everywhere. There were places where the Anarchs could kind of get over their shit enough to talk to each other and like lock stuff down.
Right.
So anyway, the conclave of...
I'm just imagining it was a SoCal Anarch. Oh man, I'm NorCal.
Dude, I don't know how those guys in Santa Monica go. And Teresa's kind of crazy.
God, don't get me started on Teresa.
Oh, her sister Jeanette, though.
Oh yeah, she's wild.
That's officially the Baron of Santa Monica, which is really awesome. So anyway, the Conclave of Prague, or the First Convention of Prague, was an international gathering held by the highest-ranking members of the Camarilla in 2012. So this was basically a response from the Second Inquisition. So the Second Inquisition started. We know Shrekneck and all that stuff happened.
Shrekneck.
So in response, the elders of the Camarilla got together and they were like, hey, we got to do something about this. So Theo Bell, who's a character we'll talk about a little bit more, was kind of like the Brujah enforcer for the Camarilla.
Okay.
He was an Archon, so he worked for many of the Justicars who go around and solve problems.
So he's kind of high up.
Yeah, and he was like, basically, we'll talk about him a little bit more, but one of the things he was very much known for was having a no-nonsense kind of aura that he would shut down on political games being played when there was a problem. So if Theo Bell was backing up your Justicar going into a situation, people were like, maybe I shouldn't think of all the petty squabbles I have, or this guy might just kill me.
Right.
He has a backstory that goes back to, early American slavery and stuff like that. So we'll talk about a little of them. But anyway, he was an important character in this. And he was there to back up his Justicar and the Camarilla who basically he served. Make no mistake, he was not an Anarch. He was a member of the Camarilla, specifically an Archon in the Camarilla. So during the conclave, the Anarchs are also coming forward to the Camarilla, and they're talking about, hey, this kind of sucks. The Camarilla meddling with the world's national governments is what caused this. You guys need to stop this. And then basically Theo Bell realized or came into possession of knowledge that to divert attention from themselves, Camarilla elders were starting to give in and give up Anarch elders and Anarch younger groups. So they were selling that information to the Vatican to basically get out. So Theo flipped a switch overnight and took a shotgun to Hartstad the Younger. It's like, no, we don't do this.
He killed Hartstad the Younger.
So the shot rang out and basically the Brujah seceded from the Camarilla.
I mean, that's a good reason.
Yeah. The Gangrel actually did too at a different event, but we'll talk about that later. So at that point, no longer were like the elder Brujah or you had like the city Brujah and the country Brujah. Now all the Brujah were like, no, you done fucked up. You done made a mistake here. So nowadays the Anarch movement is still a collection of specific small political ideologies and groups, but also there is a greater fuel for the Anarch movement by the Brujah clan, because
Mhm.
the Brujah clan has always been a little bit more together.
Yeah.
The gangrels aren't. So the Brujah clan basically now exclusively, for the most part, being Anarchs, has essentially fueled it to be a bigger power player.
Right. You're gaining organization here, where previously everything was just kind of scattered and falling apart.
Yeah, you're definitely gaining like a strong ideology
Mhm.
now that's backed by rabble rousers.
And like these are the generals. So these are the heavy hitters, the ones that really know how to lay siege, so to speak, and lead people.
Which is what I think is very interesting, is that basically when the gangrel and the Brujah both left, that's when the Camarilla started looking around, and all of a sudden those ugly Nosferatu
Yeah.
were super important to them.
Right.
They were like, "Oh no, blessed child." But of course, Nosferatu are always clan first, so that's pretty interesting.
Right.
But that's also why discussions with the Banu Hakim and
Mhm.
the Lasombra and everything started happening, because they were like, "We got a problem. Those Anarchs really are not happy with us."
So you said this is all happening in the 40s?
Sorry, the Theo Bell revolt happened in the 2012s. The Anarch Free
So
States.
very recent.
That's
okay.
the very recent.
Okay.
That was the Second Inquisition. When we go back and talk to Jeremy about Jeremy McNeil, we'll talk about, I guess that's a good segue. Let's talk about Jeremy McNeil, also known as Poor Man's Highlander.
I am immortal.
Yeah. I want to ask you a simple question just by that one statement. Where do you think Jeremy McNeil was born, and what do you think that happened as soon as he got embraced?
Was it the Highlands of Scotland?
Ding, ding, ding.
Did he meet a Spaniard?
Actually, pretty freaking close. His people did kick him out because they feared he was spawning.
Okay, yep. I kind of forgot that part.
Yep.
But yep.
And so he basically traveled the United Kingdom serving as a mercenary and found himself eventually opposing the British rule over Ireland.
Mm-hmm.
And then it wasn't really a Spaniard, it was Robin Hood.
Robin Hood.
He ran into
Just
a
in a bar.
So instead of a Frenchman pretending to be a Scotsman talking to a Scotsman pretending to be an Egyptian who is dressed as a Spaniard, we have a Scotsman who decided to go find another Britishman who he was rebelling against, but is now sided with the French who hate the British anyway.
Right.
Okay, sure.
I mean, it's Europe. I mean, it's depending upon the week, everything kind of changed over there.
So anyway, the thing you need to know about Jeremy is basically, he's Highlander. He traveled to France once he had immortality, hooked up with Robin Leland, who is part of the Furores.
Right.
Basically ran into a woman named Marguerite, who he was in love with. She was part of Leland's. She was essentially Leland's protege and like on and off lover. Apparently Jeremy and Marguerite went back and forth, and they decided that, hey, they were going to travel to the New World.
Oh, that's a good idea.
So they went over to the New World. Unfortunately, when they got there, the Civil War erupted.
Well, I mean, it seems like that's probably not a terrible thing for vampires at that time. A lot of chaos going on.
Yeah.
Insert yourself pretty easy.
So Marguerite went back to actually help out the French in the War for Independence.
Okay.
So she was involved with a lot of that, while Jeremy basically wandered around and eventually ran his way through the Civil War era in the Wild West. Kind of did the whole gunman thing.
So do we know what side he was on?
I believe he was. Okay, I'll put this out here.
Do you wear gray or do you wear blue?
I'm pretty sure he was blue. I don't think he was. Yeah, I don't think he's like the poster boy. I don't think they're going to put him on the side of
slavery.
He ended up anyway in the West. So, and I'm sure there are like books and books written about this guy. So I'm sure you can go dive into his deep dark story. And I'm sure there's a lot of fanboys who would hate this. But basically the problem. So in the 1940s, he arrived in Los Angeles.
Mm-hmm.
So after his travels and everything, he ended up arriving in Los Angeles. And Los Angeles was ruled over by a Toreador prince named Don Sebastian.
Okay.
And there's a lot of stuff about Don Sebastian being basically a hedonite. He used to go
he's a Toreador.
He's a Toreador. He used to go to, I think in LA by Night, they talk about him being a tremendously fat man. And he used to go to restaurants and basically like feast himself on people.
Oh, wow.
And he would like eat a bunch of food and then throw up and then drain all the waiters and stuff.
There's a shortage of waiters. We don't know why.
Anyway, so essentially, Don Sebastian was pretty much a crooked prince. He was like essentially the poster child for princes that needed to get their throats ripped out.
Yeah.
And ultimately, McNeil essentially had to petition Don Sebastian for an audience and ask for justice after a bunch of Black and Hispanic anarchs basically got the shit kicked out of them for just basically being the wrong color at the wrong point in time.
Oh, okay.
Specifically, the people that assaulted them was a coterie of violent toreador, and basically they just were, it was just purely racially motivated from Jeremy's perspective. So he thought it was like, yeah, we have to get this fixed. So let's talk about two different ways that this could have gone down because this is insightful. So if you listen to the Brujah, they're like, Jeremy went in there and demanded justice, and basically the corrupted prince has over like 100 ghouls beat the crap out of him and just tear him down and beat him unconscious and throw him in an alleyway and just spit on him, calling him a low blood clan and all this other stuff. And, just basically that lit the fires in him that he needed to.
Right.
Yeah, okay. If you actually find out anybody that knew what happened, he walked in there and the Don used dominate on him and made him bash his head against the floor until he passed out. Either way,
oh man, that's the good story.
He woke up in a dumpster, like basically moments before sundown or before sunrise, and he basically hid himself in trash until the next night. So this is where the stories basically sync back up. So he basically wandered into the haven of an ally, this guy Salvador Garcia, who's another big guy in the Brujah stuff. We might go into that in the Brujah stuff. But basically, he was like, hey, man, this stuff, I had 100 ghouls.
Are you sure that's just not brain damage?
Oh, man, there were so many. Just so many.
You have this brick wall pattern just kind of imprinted on your forehead.
So anyway, he convinced basically Salvador, and then I think Marguerite showed back up that they needed to do something about this. So ultimately they got together and formed the Second Anarch Revolt, and they went in there and they basically took the Don's head. So coincidentally, when you have a really crappy prince like that and a bunch of other princedoms nearby, like in a place like California where you have LA, San Francisco, Fremont, you just go down there. All the other anarchs who are young and impressionable start going, that's a great idea.
Oh, no.
So basically, like a chain of fire, all these princes essentially lost their head, except I think the only one that maintained was San Francisco.
Oh.
Not sure where that led to, but I think they were the only one that actually managed. So that was essentially the Second Anarch Revolt and the formation of the Anarch Free States. So if you find yourself embraced in that part of the country, you probably have heard these tales as like this heroic or mythical exploit. So the Anarch Free States actually stuck around for a long time too. They basically lived through World War II. They stuck around through basically the 60s, the 70s. It was only far later when essentially like the invasion of the Chinese vampires.
Okay.
The Kuei Jin invasion, which basically was essentially the Asian influence in California during the like late 80s or 90s.
Yep.
That led to the weakening of the Anarch Authority to the point where the Camerlo came back in and like notably Prince LaCroix of LA showed back up. This is legitimately.
Right.
So then basically that's where you get into kind of the events of Vampire Bloodlines and LA by Night, where now there's a Camerla presence on the West Coast, but still mainly the Camerla is like, trying to take over Anarch lands.
Right. They're still struggling, but like they're beating back the Anarchs for the most part.
Yeah. So some weird mentions of some of this stuff. So that the Camerla and the Sabbat were all driven out in the Anarchan sarcophagus crisis, which is basically what the lore calls Vampire Bloodlines.
Okay.
Because it's the sarcophagus that was over.
Gotcha. Yeah.
So like for some reason the Sabbat were driven out during that period of time too. I'm not sure about that, but
I mean, they were there in the game.
Yeah, I think it's just like the Anarchs got their stuff together. Yeah. Basically once again,
just kicked them out, basically.
When a prince falls, Anarchs tend to like really band together for a period of time. Yeah. Because then that's, hey. So
anarchy. Some
other notable Anarchs that you're going to hear a lot about: Tyler, Patricia of Bolingbrook, her original name. We talked a lot about her, and she's a elder member of the Brujah clan. But Tyler is also kind of vampires have mythos that could walk into a bar and sit down and have a night with you.
Okay.
Right?
Yeah.
So that's the weird thing. So,
yeah, you hit some dive bar and you're sitting there and there's somebody there that just seems world weary or, beyond their years, and it just turns out, hey, you're just talking to Robin Hood.
Seriously, exactly. Like you're reading the 5th edition Anarch book, they have a lot of, so the way those books are written, which is something that's really awesome, is that generally each piece of information is passed from the perspective of somebody in the world. So no piece of information is 100% true.
Yeah.
It's always from the viewpoint of someone. And like when they start talking about like the heroes of the Anarch movement, like Tyler, they're talking about like some guy who's basically like, oh man, I remember when. So speaking of Marguerite going over and helping the French Revolution.
Yep.
Big Anarch movement, right?
Right.
So Paris was a stronghold of the Toreador, and when the Anarchs came in during the Revolution, for a period of time, they kind of had this wonderful time of just tearing Toreador out
beheading
of their houses,
people.
Beheading people. I think the description is that some of the Anarchs were like rolling around trying to prevent themselves from laying at the foot of the guillotine with their mouth open.
You'd think you'd read more about that in the history books.
Like, oh, there's Crazy Eddie.
Crazy Eddie.
But like one of them writes this whole thing, and he part of it, he talks about his experiences during that period of time and how eventually it led, because the Camarilla took Paris back over. But eventually he talks about, he thinks he spent one night with an Anarch woman who he can only assume is Tyler. Like, it's just kind of crazy. Like, whoa, but yeah, so like literally walking legends come in and out of stories kind of like crazy. So
That's
never know when
really cool.
Yeah, you're actually talking about mythos to someone, and you're actually talking to them about their
right.
So basically, we've talked about the Brujah walkout, we've talked about the Gangrel walkout. In recent times, the Ministry. So
I love that band.
So basically, when the Assamites petitioned, so the Banu Hakim.
Yep.
Now the Banu Hakim petitioned for Camarilla acceptance, and the Sombra were like finding their ways to get in. The Ministry knew that like if it wasn't going to be like a Sabbat party in the Camarilla,
right?
Like they knew there were going to be
heavy restrictions.
Yeah,
they're always going to be watched.
Yeah, they were going to be the late to show up. So they decided to side with the people across the river, the Anarchs.
Right.
So the Ministry being essentially the group of the Setites that pretend to be together. Also, it's pretty much known through Setite like kind of communications that the people in the Ministry who are part of the Anarchs are doing so to corrupt it. And they figure that this is their avenue to corrupt basically the Anarch movement. So
just leave them be.
Another clan that's involved with the Anarchs are the Temice. So once
don't see too many of those anymore.
No, they were also lords of the Sabbat, but basically the Temice that are not part of the religious fervor, or like, because the Sabbat in modern times are off like literally fighting the elders,
right?
So the like Temice that don't need to, they basically join the Anarchs too. And then obviously the Caitiff, who eventually we'll get to, which are the people that don't show lineage,
right? And
of course, the biggest source of people these days are the Duskborn or the Thinbloods.
Yep.
So, I mean, the Camarilla claim that no one above the 14th generation can join them. So that means that pretty much all Thinbloods
they have no choice.
Yeah. So there are bits and pieces of some of the other clans. I think some writer wrote all of these because I've never seen any reference to any of these, but they're the Unchained Balkavians.
Okay.
The Red Nosferatu. The Abstract Toreador.
Sounds like some guy just got a thesaurus,
pretty much,
like picked a page and then said that Nosferatu.
Yeah, it's kind of, So, enter Jeremy McNeil, 300-year-old Scottish Brujah, arrived into town. It's really weird looking at writing in a mythos of a game that you weren't there when it was developed. I really don't know why there's so many people who just really love this guy.
I think it's the meme value. That's honestly what I think it is. Like you have these things where it's obvious. Like it is obvious who this guy is based off of. And it's like, you know what? Instead of bitching about it, I'm just going to lean into it and I'm going to have fun with it.
Dude going into a meeting with a, ponytail and a trench coat.
using a Japanese katana.
I'm waiting for it. I want to find out. I'm sure there's some piece of artwork, and I just got to figure out who, did they get confused and they base him off Connor or Duncan?
Oh yeah, that'd be funny. He's got a ponytail.
Yeah. So yeah. So the other thing to know about the Anarchs is they're not supposed, they should not be, even though in modern times, the Anarchs, also known as the Unbound, probably include the autarchus.
Okay.
Which is just a word of saying the people who basically have no political ideology.
Okay.
So they really don't even gather to form any sort of, and that's really where the gangrel come in, is like the Brujah are going to get together and be like, those Camarilla, we want to do something. The gangrel don't really get together.
Yeah.
And then if they do get together, they're just going to have
a fight.
Yeah. They're going to have different types. So this kind of term of like the Anarchs, the Camarilla will basically call anybody who's not specifically Sabbat, like they're going to be Anarchs.
Mm-hmm.
But the people who actually call themselves Anarchs are only going to be the people who are like have a political agenda in mind. So, yeah. Birth of the Anarch Free States. I think we went over that.
Mm-hmm.
The principles of the anarcho-mutualist theory.
Okay. That sounds like it's a manual.
Pretty much.
A manifesto.
It should be said that basically Jeremy McNeil, although in theory is still alive, he often disappears and doesn't get involved in things. And that basically the Anarch Free State basically descended into squabbling between violent gang warfare, and Jeremy McNeil was not very happy about this.
Yeah, I'm sure he's not.
So if you're interested in the Anarch Free States and that whole kind of storyline, literally just go listen to LA by Night, because LA by Night details the kind of the goings on with a bunch of vampires who live in LA. They deal with the Baron Abrams and like the current Baron Teresa, and like they did a pretty good job with it. I think we said originally it tends to get a little ham. I love and hate the dude that they got to do Nines Rodriguez, because like when he shows up, you're like, wow, that's him. And then when you listen to him for the 10th time, you're like, dude, okay, now are we just, it's like that dude who memorized one soliloquy in like from Shakespeare, and he has to find a way to bring it up every single time.
Right.
Yeah. Anyway. So yeah. The Anarch movement is a great way to have a campaign if you don't want the rigid structure of the campaign.
Right. You got a bunch of loners or just people that are kind of difficult to get along with.
Yeah. So technically an Anarch campaign is really any campaign that doesn't have the Camarilla. Right. So maybe you want to tell a story about a bunch of kindred in, a place like the Midwest where really there's not enough people to form the structure of the Camarilla, but like there's 3 or 4 people who come together and they form a council and they say, hey, we're going to make up some rules, just a few. And
so we don't get each other killed.
Yeah. The other thing to be note too is the Anarchs don't really care that much about diablerie. So
that could be interesting.
Yeah. So a lot of the Anarch, specifically when we get into like the Brujah and stuff like that, some of them pride themselves on feasting on Camarilla Ventrue.
Ooh, that could be a scary combination.
Yeah, because they like getting hold of those juicy ivory tower blood bags. So things that we talk about with the Camarilla and like with a structured society too don't always, like I said, affect the Anarchs. Most of the time, if Anarchs come to rule, you can expect a Baron. Oh, yeah, we neglected the structure that the Anarchs have.
There you go. Let's talk about the structure. Sure. So, hey, Grey, what's the structure of Anarch's society look like?
Oh, I'm so glad you asked, Owen. So because, quite literally the Anarchs have no structure, you can't really say that they do have a definite structure. But oftentimes, certain patterns will emerge. So notably, one of them is the Baron. In simplest terms, the Baron is basically an Anarch who is strong enough to set down some laws in a place.
And people listen.
Yeah. So although they're maybe the equivalent of a prince, they're not going to set up all the structure of a society. They're basically just going to be like, hey, I'm in charge. My rule is law, and these are my boundaries. Now, if you want to play that game here, that's cool. Let's, I'll let you do some stuff, but you got to play by my rules. Likewise, Anarchs often will have a emissary, and an emissary is essentially an Anarch that must essentially handle the negotiations or the discussions with other Anarchs to establish terms between boundaries. So if you're a Baron and I'm a Baron, I likely need to elect an emissary who I hope he doesn't go missing, but he could. So they need to be expendable, but also that basically is going to go over and carry on the diplomatic relations between us so that we can kind of talk. And,
Right.
and sure, you could call them ambassador or herald or anything else, but the point is it's someone expendable that we sent as a mediator.
Mm-hmm.
So a sweeper is a basically anarch who often gets sent out to take a census of the people in his land.
Okay.
It's basically a baron's kind of scout. A baron's kind of, not really, they're not a sheriff. They don't go out and they basically dictate rule, but they often go out and try to get the vibe of everything that's going on.
Make sure nobody's doing something they should be.
Yeah. So they're both basically going to fix problems,
Mm-hmm.
but they're also going to literally just keep a record of how many different vampires are in their area.
Okay.
So,
yeah, I mean, it's like a census taker.
Yeah, so some barons will call them census takers. Many anarchs will refer to them as terms like sweeper, proctor, Sherlock, and even abacus, apparently.
How many anarchs you got living in that house? You don't need to know.
And there is one other title that an anarch can have from other anarchs, and that is the chameleon or the bond.
Okay.
Bond as in a slang term for James Bond.
Okay.
And this is when an anarch goes into the Camarilla and finds its position there to report back. This is 100% a spy. So essentially an anarch who holds some authority in one of the other sects, specifically designed to inform the people he came from about what's going on.
Gotcha.
So it's pretty cool. Yeah. Anarchs, man. They're somewhere between the problem across the river and the only thing that's protecting you from being dominated by that elder Ventrue.
Pretty much, yeah. I mean, it's an interesting group. I mean, you pretty much have a little bit of everybody mixed in there, but the cohesion isn't quite strong enough to really be a major issue unless you really piss them off.
Yeah, I'm not sure where anarchs are very much from the kind of philosophy of a group of people that is almost ineffectual unless you piss them off.
Right.
They're the group that, like, as long as you don't push them, they're not going to do anything because that's the only thing that can drive them to get together. Mm-hmm. If you whip them up in a fury, if you whip them up in a self-righteous crusade, you're toast. But otherwise, they're just going to squabble and fight amongst themselves.
They're the mob waiting for the fire to start.
Very much so. And largely, like you said, they're 40K orcs.
Yeah, yeah.
Like, a big anarch comes around and says, "Oi, we got to take them cammies."
Oi, yous lot. Time for some crumping.
Wrong setting, man. Where are you? Greenskin vampires.
I mean, that would be pretty interesting. Get a bunch of, soccer hooligans,
It's quite literally. There are 100% in the setting, considering that London was like a bastion of adventure and everything. There were soccer hooligans who were kicking down doors and dragging people out. 100%. There were basically space orcs
doing football cheers.
Aye. All right. Well, I think that gives us a pretty good overview of Anarchs and the Anarch.
Yeah, I mean, we've got a good dose of Brujah in there too.
Yep, which won't be next, but we will get to them. Maybe give a little palate cleanser in between.
Yeah, let people forget about them a little bit.
Yeah, this next week we're going to get a short one, so we're going to tackle the clan of the gangrel, those who know the beast best, and much like their enigmatic members, we're not going to have a lot to talk about.
They're not quite as fleshed out as everybody else, is what you're saying?
Not so much.
Okay.
But that'll happen next time. So once again, guys, if you're still listening to this and you still don't know why you are, we thank you, and we will hopefully catch you next time.
Yeah, hopefully that guy in Germany still listens to us.
Heck yeah.